Yo, what's going on, everybody? It is Tuesday, October 11th. Well, we were having a good day, and actually I thought like today could be the beginning of a bounce at least through late tomorrow and Thursday, because we should be getting some positive fiscal, but next week we get another tax drain. It's not going to be as big as the September one, but you know, with the market so on the defensive right now, that's gonna be a negative. But anyway, I want to talk about today because, you know, we were getting a good bounce going there, and then all of a sudden, comments from the Bank of England's Governor Andrew Bailey. He was giving a speech in Washington, and this really got me angry, man. He was giving a speech in Washington. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern time, and he comes out with what I think is one of the most irresponsible statements, comments that I've heard. And that, you know, that's saying a lot, because these central bankers, I mean, now, ever since Bernanke, you know, this desire to be transparent, like, you know, Bernanke came up with this, like, okay, we're going to make the Fed more transparent. In other words, you know, we're going to try to communicate to the market exactly how our policies will evolve. And prior to Bernanke, you know, for the entire history of the Fed, central banks really, not just the Fed, but nearly all central banks, and most of them follow the Fed anyway. But prior to Bernanke, like, policy was really opaque. I mean, you had to wait until that meeting every month, you know, and see what they said in their statement. And there wasn't all this jibber jabbering in between. You know, trying to influence the reaction function of market participants, and you know, that's just injecting a lot of needless volatility into the market. I mean, these guys are really doing a lot of damage, not so much with their policy, but just with the constant injection of volatility. Anyway, this guy Andrew Bailey, and he should be fired right now. He says, well, hey, you only got 3 days. UK pension funds and banks, you only got 3 days now to get your shit together in terms of you know, your holdings, your bond holdings, and your duration, because hey, you know, don't expect us to do this, you know, for anything more than a temporary situation. So like, here's the guy running the Bank of England. First of all, you have to understand something, okay? Central banks came about as a consequence of extreme volatility and you know, repeating booms and busts that were the history of financial markets prior to the advent of central banks. Central banks were supposed to, you know, smooth that out, be there as the lender of last resort, be there as a regulator of the financial system, you know, making sure that banks are sufficiently capitalized, that they have the right assets, etc. So they came into being essentially to avoid this pattern of wild swings, ups and downs. And what's interesting is, like, especially like, you know, in the case of the United States, if you go back to prior to the Fed's creation in 1913, you know, in the 19th century, there were constant, almost every 10 years, these cycles of booms and busts. It got to the point where the Morgan Bank, led by J.P. Morgan, Pierpont Morgan, you know, it was the crisis of 1907 that Morgan, he was the one, in essence, kind of acting as a central bank. He gathered together, you know, other banks and backed the financial system at a time when there was a very severe panic, the panic of 1907. So, you know, privately, they saw that there was a need for some backstop, some big financial entity, you know, to calm things down, to provide liquidity, to avert bankruptcies and defaults when it was unnecessary because of panic, whatever, or temporary conditions. So they actually, Pierpont Morgan actually acted in the fashion of a central bank, and eventually the U.S. government, Congress, created the Fed. But anyway, here's the thing. It's very irresponsible for, I mean, that is the central bank, at least part of the central bank's function. If you are going to set a policy rate, here's the thing, because what Bailey said, if you think about it, is essentially like saying, hey, you know what? We don't care about our policy rate. Wherever it goes, it goes. And if you get in trouble because of that, because of your positioning, your investments, you know, your holdings, your assets, if they blow up, that's on you. Okay? Number one, you have to understand that these central banks set the rules as to what assets banks are allowed to hold, okay? So it's predetermined what the bank is allowed to hold as an asset. You know, what kind of loans, what kind of securities, etc. So the bank, the central bank creates the rules saying, okay, you want to be a bank? Fine, we'll give you a charter, but here are the assets you are allowed to hold. In other words, the central bank already signs off on certain types of assets, all right? It says, these are the ones that we allow you to hold, and they're very, you know, they're conservative. I mean, they're government securities. Then the central bank engages in monetary policy, setting interest rates, where it is now, and we'll talk about the current situation, where it is sending signals to the market, again, through its jibber-jabbering, through people like Bailey talking, we got to fight inflation, we're going to keep pushing up the rate. We're going to keep pushing up the rate, okay? Like what the Fed is doing right now. So the whole entire yield curve starts to reflect that they don't say we're going to push up the rate until November and then we're going to stop. They're going to say, we don't know. We're just going to keep pushing up the rate. So the whole entire yield curve reflects that because, you know, the interest rate at any point along the curve reflects the central bank's policy over that term. In other words, you know, what is a 10-year rate? It's the belief by market participants what the Fed or the Bank of England's policy is going to be over a 10-year period. And if they're saying we're just going to keep raising rates, well, then the curve is going to reflect that. And so that starts to impact these financial holdings, these assets of financial institutions like pension funds and banks. You know, they have to mark these to the market, so they're having huge losses. So then the central bank says, well, we're just going to let that happen. So in other words, you're telling us we can only own these assets. You sign off on, you know, that these are the correct assets that we can own according to your regulatory, you know, mandates. So we go along with that. These are supposed to be safe, good assets. Then you engage in monetary policy that jeopardizes the performance of these assets. And rather than, you know, keeping the system in place, which you are affecting by your policies, you say, the guy says, well, we're not going to do this forever. In other words, you know, we're just ceding this over to the market wherever it goes. Okay, so what's happening here is you're abrogating your responsibility as a central bank. So the question is, if they're not going to do their job, or if they do their job in such a shitty way that it literally blows up, you know, the reason why they're there, to keep things stable, then why do we need them? This was an idiotic, ridiculous statement by Bailey. And the guy should be kicked out on his ass immediately right now. But of course he won't. It's a clique. It's this club. And they're all in it. And once they're in it, you know, then they stay in it. So we had this big reversal. He says it at 3 o'clock when the London markets are all closed and people over there are sleeping. So, we're going to get a big negative reaction in the London market tomorrow. The pound went down, of course. Everything got hit. I mean, it could have been a much worse performance today because we ended up positive on the Dow. We were down, off the lows, but I'm just thinking like by tomorrow morning they're going to erase that. But it's just, I just find it to be outrageous that these guys continue to do this stuff. I mean, this is just injecting needless volatility through this constant jibber-jabbering. If we're going to have these central banks, personally, I think that central banks should just be relegated to the role of regulating the banking system. In other words, making sure banks are sufficiently capitalized, making sure they have the assets that they're allowed to have, okay, and not, piling into very highly speculative things. And, being a lender of last resort because, you shouldn't be disciplining banks through the liability side of the balance sheet. In other words, you shouldn't allow bank runs. That was another reason why these things were created. So that you wouldn't have bank runs. Deposits are guaranteed by the government. The government's, well, maybe not in Europe, but in the United States, deposits are guaranteed by the government. So if the government is telling people, yeah, go ahead, it's okay to put your money in the banks, and then the central banks, we saw this happen in 2008 with the financial crisis. There was one bank, it was Wachovia at the time, that got shut down. It got taken over. I believe it got taken over by, I think Citibank was a bidder, but in the end it was Wells Fargo or vice versa. I don't remember. And it got shut down not because of an insolvency, which is the only real reason to shut down a bank is when it's insolvent, when its liabilities exceed its assets. It was shut down because basically of a bank run. The Fed allowed it to happen. And I remember this explicitly because there was a news conference when at the time, who's the banking regulator? I forget the title, but it was Sheila Bair, FDIC chair Sheila Bair was pointedly asked the question, was Wachovia insolvent? To which she replied, no. So what's the reason for shutting it down or liquidating it? It's crazy. That's what these people are there for, to preclude that from happening, but yet they do. So, folks, I've said this a million times. This whole thing is run by dummies. Like, they may be educated people because, maybe they went to fancy schools, and that's the thing. They're all in the club. They all went to Harvard. So maybe they're very, in the case of in the UK, they all went to Cambridge, right? Oxford. So they're all in the club. Same thing in government at the highest levels of foreign policy. That's why the world is a mess right now. These people are dummies. They maybe have very expensive educations and very elite educations, but when it comes down to it, they're dummies. And they're putting the whole entire world into a hell of a mess. Here's a guy who's running the Bank of England who basically says, well, we're not going to do our job and screw you if your positions go against you. Then my question is, what is the need for you? What is the need for your institution? We don't need it. In a country like the United States or a country like Britain, if you're going to have a central bank, in my opinion, it should be as a regulator of the financial system. Again, making sure that, banks and financial entities are holding the right kind of assets. All right. As a lender of last resort to preclude, bank runs, because that shouldn't be happening. And the interest rate should be set permanently at zero. Countries that are currency issuers should not be paying interest on their money. That's stupid. And the management of the economy in terms of, growth and inflation and employment, that should be a matter of fiscal policy, not monetary policy. That's the way it should be set up. I mean, and you should not have these guys, running around, making these ridiculous statements, injecting all kinds of needless volatility into the financial markets. I mean, it's like, it's just like throwing a bomb into a room for no reason whatsoever. And this goes on and on and on, like every day now. Like this whole entire market sell-off, at least I would say, starting in August with late August with Powell's Jackson Hole speech. Look, September was real, and I talked about that going all the way back to June. I said we're going to have a big tax strain in September. It's not going to be as big as April, but it ended up to be worse because, we had the tax strain, which was amplified or made worse, exacerbated by the jibber jabber, all the volatility that the Fed injected with, these hawkish comments every single day. I've lost count of how many rallies were aborted. I mean, there were plenty of times when you could see the market was coming back, and it was coming back for good, valid, fundamental reasons. I mean, we just, had the third upward revision in Q3 economic growth to 3%. I've been talking about that. That's good growth. Market should naturally rise under those conditions because growth means higher profits, higher income. But these rallies were scuttled because every single day these guys are coming out with statements like this, and it's just designed to torpedo. I don't even know if they're necessarily designed to torpedo, but they're not helpful. They're just injecting volatility. It's needless volatility, and stuff starts to blow up. Stuff starts to blow. I mean, if you walk into, I don't know what an example is, but I mean, if you walked into a situation, a room where it said on the door, highly flammable, they're not going to let you walk in there with a flaming torch. You got to take precautions. But this is exactly what they're doing. They're torching everything. The big picture, I think everything's going to end up to be okay because, like I said many times, look, if the government's spending $7 trillion, for me personally, I'm not worried. And now we're starting to see, I said it yesterday, I mean, we're seeing fiscal packages being unveiled in Germany, in France. This is a good thing. But in the meantime, I mean, these guys are throwing bombs into rooms that are packed with it, just everyone on tenterhooks. They're throwing bombs in there. Everyone's ready to jump every time they say something like this, and it's totally, and this goes beyond, what Bailey said goes beyond even throwing bombs, because it's like, hey, we're not going to do our job. So screw you there's no other, in this case, there's no other alternative. That's the TINA thing, right? What Thatcher said, TINA. There is no alternative because these banks, these central banks were tasked with doing this. So it's not like they're going to say, oh, we're not going to do it anymore, but then there's some backup institution or some other entity behind them that'll step in. No, they're the sole providers of this function. And when they say, we're not going to do it, you got 3 days to get your shit together. I mean, what the hell is that? Guy's an idiot. He's got to go. Got to go. Anyway, that's it for today, folks. Bad. I mean, it's just like, man, I'm telling you, this is getting ridiculous already. Like, we're never going to get rid of these people. It's the same thing in foreign policy. These crazed, psychopathic warmongers. I mean, it's always the same thing. War, war, war. We need more money for military, for war, for defense. I mean, you could blow up the world, 100 times over now. No, it's never enough. We need another war to justify more spending. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. Then you need like some public policy, to get passed. Infrastructure. We're driving on broken down roads. No, we don't have the money for that. Money for COVID. No, we don't have the money for that. It's disgusting. It really is. Anyway, that's it for today. Bye.